much revolution. Today we're going to talk about the concept of surplus value. It makes the most sense to already have a good foundation on what use value and exchange value already are. You can find them on our previous videos. So we'll start off by talking about simple trade, which does not lead to surplus value. It's important that we understand that surplus value grows out of exchanging things, but it is not the same as exchanging things. Next, we'll talk about the so-called perfectly fair form of surplus value. Merchant capital consists of buying a commodity at a lower price and then selling it at a higher price to create surplus value. Then we'll talk about industrial capital, which consists of buying a commodity at a lower price, using labor to change the commodity through production, and then selling it at a higher price to create surplus value. We'll begin to understand the nature of capitalism once we understand surplus value. One must understand surplus value as the difference between the use value of labor as a commodity and the exchange value of all the commodities. So labor stands unique among commodities. Its use value allows for all other use values to exist. Let me explain. Labor lets human beings pick apples, write poetry, and do the equations that allow us to send rockets into space. Everything comes from labor. However, when we have an exchange value, then the unique aspects of every different type of labor get collapsed into a single, universal, interchangeable exchange value, for which we usually use money. This leads to something interesting and unique. The labor value and exchange value become separated in the commodity. Imagine a quote-unquote fair wage paid for labor, this is the exchange value of labor, to pick fields and get vegetables. The landlord makes money when he's selling these vegetables for quote-unquote a fair price. He walks away with a significant profit. We've all got to ask ourselves, where does this profit or surplus value come from? So let's talk a little bit about the method of how people buy and sell things to satisfy their desires. A farmer grows crops, takes them to market, sells them, and then buys the supplies he needs for the month, the season, or year. Very simple. You take your commodity to market, get money, and then you buy the commodities you need. No one can doubt when you look at the college professor, a painter, or a fast food worker. They take their commodity, which is labor, sell it, and buy what they need in order to live. This becomes the famous commodity to money to commodity prime chain. Prime here is understood as a variation. However, you'll notice that there's no surplus value in this simple exchange. Surplus value requires a different invention and way of acting to happen. Now let's talk about the method of how people buy and sell to make money and not to survive. So we have a basic situation where someone has money and wants to make more money by trading. They have money, they buy a commodity, and then they sell that commodity for more money. This quote-unquote more money is what we mean by surplus value. We don't see this very often today in the developed world, but it's important to understand it as a concept. Buying something at a yard sale and then selling it online remains about as close to the modern version of this example. We can understand this as merchant capital. However, we'll talk about one other form of surplus value, which is industrial capital. So let's talk about the nature of industrial capital and its method of extracting or creating surplus value. Industrial capital begins with someone having money. He buys up some original commodity. He uses labor as a commodity to produce another commodity. Finally, he sells his commodity for money. This seems much more complicated, but let's try and understand it as a formula. This formula is M to C to P, that's production, to C prime to M prime. That's word salad and something close to algebra as the example. Let's use a concrete example to make things more clear. First, he has money. He uses money to buy all the ingredients he needs to make apple pies. He pays someone to bake a bunch of apple pies. Then he sells these apple pies for cold hard cash. So imagine he's a perfectly moral person and pays fair market price for every step of the way, for every ingredient, and to the person working for him. The money he makes will be greater than the money he spent on producing. Thus, he will have generated surplus value. Here we have industrial capital. We've talked about two ways of extracting surplus value that become essential to the formation of capitalism. However, there are many other ways of extracting surplus value from labor which isn't given a quote-unquote fair market price. Slavery extracts surplus value from the labor of the enslaved person. If an area is desperate for work, many workers will accept a lower or unfair wage so they can survive. Exploiters can find all sorts of other different ways to gain surplus value from people. However, in our next video, we'll talk about capitalism as such, and we'll see how these two forms of surplus value become the cornerstones of the entire system. This video has been brought to you by Surplus Value. We squeeze you for more than what you've got. Surplus Value. Like and subscribe and share if you can. We'll catch you on the next one.